Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, this is a very strange debate we're having in the House this afternoon, and it's a very strange debate because, in fact, the government has no clothes. The government is presenting itself on this occasion as being fiscally responsible. Actually, the government isn't being fiscally responsible. If you look at the options that the government has in terms of paying for the Christchurch rebuild, there are three basic options. You can cut spending, you can borrow more, or you can raise more revenue. Now, the most responsible approach would be to actually raise more revenue, because that would protect the government's books. If your concern is fiscal responsibility, then what you try to do is make sure that you raise the money to cover the cost of the rebuild. In fact, what the government plans to do is borrow the money. This is, in fact, a borrow and hope government. Now, of course, the kind of presentation of the National Party, what's kind of core to the National Party is that it is the fiscally responsible party, and it wants to present itself to the world as the party that will safely look after the books. In fact, we have many quotes from the Minister of Finance where he talks at some length about the problems of increased borrowing. Just on the 1st of February, Mr English said in relation to the Labor Party plan, which he claimed would lead to $5 billion more borrowing, Mr English said that $5 billion of more borrowing would almost certainly lead to credit ratings downgrades for New Zealand, pushing up interest rates for Kiwi families and businesses and costing jobs. Well, that's a fair statement from the Minister of Finance. The question is, then why is the Minister of Finance and the government proposing to dramatically increase borrowing to pay for the rebuild in Christchurch? The most fiscally responsible thing to do is, in fact, to strike a temporary levy. If you are to pay for the rebuild, you should reach out to fellow New Zealanders who actually want to contribute to the rebuilding of Christchurch and have a temporary levy so that everybody in New Zealand who can afford it would actually contribute to the rebuild. At the end of that process, we wouldn't have government debt to pay for it because we would have paid for it out of a temporary levy. We wouldn't have had to cut spending, as this government's proposing to do. Because when you look at what options the government's choosing, they're going down a path now which is to increase borrowing and to cut spending quite savagely. The Prime Minister's comments on the weekend, for anyone who's paying attention, are actually very, very scary. Because what the Prime Minister said is that there will be zero new spending in nominal terms. What that means is a very significant cut in real terms. If we say inflation is running, let's say, at 5%, we'll see what the price of oil does, then you need to have a 5% increase to keep things where they are. In the health budget, actually it tends to run higher than general inflation, so you actually need a higher increase just to stand still. So if the government's proposing that it will keep nominal spending flat, then actually what they're talking about is a savage cut in real spending. This is the kind of cuts we have not seen since 1991. This will be a black budget. We haven't had a black budget in New Zealand since 1991. If the government does what the Prime Minister told the country he plans to do on the weekend, we will have a black budget this year because the cuts in government spending will be savage. Now, if you think that that's pretty bad because there's going to be very significant real cuts, on top of that, what the government has said is that they want to put more funding into health and education, even while keeping a cap on nominal funding overall. If you're transferring $600 to $800 million out of the rest of the budget to put it into health and education, that means the cuts in the rest of the budget are even more savage. Because not only do you have to actually cut the funding because in real terms it's dropping because you're not accounting for inflation, on top of that you've got to find another $600 to $800 million to transfer into the health and education budgets. It means that you're looking at multi-billion dollar cuts, maybe in the order of $4 billion in the rest of the budget. Those are very, very significant cuts. And people who think that it's easy to find that money, you just snip a little bit here and a snip a little bit there, you are kidding yourself. If you cut, let's say we cut working for families for everyone above $100,000, you might save $20 million, you might save $50 million, depending on how you calculate it. It's peanuts compared to the $4 billion cuts that the government is now talking about. It's not easy to find multi-billion dollar cuts in the government's budget outside of health and education. So if this is the path that the government is proposing to go down. Mr. Chair.
I call the Honourable Bill English.